it's the next best thing,
Next
connected
best thing.
virtually
Yeah,
across
yeah.
across gigantic oceans. Warm welcome everybody to both sides now. 观望东西，聆听左右. This is episode number 2. Now, I kind of realized that we may not have given our audience listening or tuning in wherever you are a better understanding of who we are in the opening episode. So here's a quick self-introduction. My name is Bob, a third generation overseas Chinese. My grandfather lived on a hill overlooking a fishing port in southern China, took a boat down approximately 70, 80 years ago now. My father was born in Singapore but raised in Malaysia. I was born in Singapore and now I carry on my grandfather's southward pointing compass to now reside in Australia. I like to connect with as many people as I can to find out more about how and what we think about China yesterday, today, and tomorrow. In particular, I am extremely keen to decode how the Chinese mind makes meaning. Personally, I think as an overseas Chinese, I may have an interesting contribution to make, a story to tell as we are a bit of a hybrid, assimilating non-Chinese ideas into our thoughts, values, behaviors, tastes, and worldviews through first-hand lived experience, perhaps demonstrating that there could be a bridge between East and West. Now, Api, I had a big identity crisis growing up in Singapore. I was unable to speak Mandarin very well. I couldn't speak Teochew, which is the language of my hometown. And I was much more comfortable expressing myself and thinking in English. I took a really, really long time, 2 decades plus, right, to come to terms with being Chinese.
I mean, that is quite a common phenomenon for our generation, in our generation of Chinese Singaporeans. I mean, most of my friends around me in school did pretty badly in the subject of Chinese.
I
And
mean, I'm curious to know, what do you score for Chinese?
Okay,
Because I struggled so badly just to
this
get a
is
pass.
going to sound extremely bosu. You know, O levels Chinese, we can take it like in June before the December
Yes.
final
Yeah.
exam.
You need to be of a certain criteria to
So
and skill to do that, right?
yeah, in June I got an A2 for Chinese.
I wasn't given because I wasn't given the option.
So
Yeah.
in June I had an A2. I was so pissed off that I retook it again in December.
Well, it really shows it's a different dimension altogether.
To just shave that 1 point off, like it looks like a smear,
Wow.
a stain on my cert.
Yeah.
But then
That's
again,
amazing.
I just got a C3 for English. So there you go. Yeah. And it sounds that way.
Yeah, because bilingualism is a core part of our operating system while we're growing up, right? To be able to straddle both command of English as well as Mandarin. So my personal story is one of, I am ethnically Chinese, so I guess I inherit some of the Chinese cultural memories which are experienced in its rituals, customs, the code of conduct, systems of organization. But I was largely brought up with the mental programming of post-British colony Singapore, an intersection of global trade while consuming Western media, literature, and a lot of its music, 95% of the time. So strangely enough, my interest in China did not begin until in my mid to late 20s. And ever since, I've traveled to, I think, approximately 20 to 30 cities in China in an attempt to document all 56 ethnicities of the Chinese, I guess, tapestry of ways of schools of thought, ways of being that exist in mainland China today.
And I thought I'm the crazy one here.
So that ramp was just like, there's a lot of catching up to do. So that's my spiel. That's my story. Avi, how about yourself? What's your relationship with being Chinese?
Well, like I mentioned, Chinese was my strong subject in school back then. But then again, it's due to my upbringing, because my father was uneducated. I guess that's not a very good way, but he did not even finish his primary school education. So
and in the context of Singapore,
Yeah, of that generation, that is actually pretty common for the middle income classes. So you either were one of those that did not finish primary school education or just had primary school education, or the other part of society of Singapore back then in the 60s and 70s was, very English educated and more or less kind of lost touch with their Chinese roots. So I came from a pretty Chinese family. And my father, being very supportive of the government's drive to build a bilingual Chinese population or bilingual Singaporean society, educated me in a way that, when I was at home, I communicated in Mandarin. When I went to school, I only spoke Chinese. When I was in school, I only spoke English. And when we visited our grandparents, which was a very common thing, I guess that's the same for most of us. We will visit our grandparents a few times a week. Sometimes, we'll have a dinner at our grandparents' place on the weekdays. So when I'm with my grandparents, I'll be speaking a dialect, in my case, Hokkien. And so effectively trilingual in a way.
Trilingual.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is, I think now it's safe to say, back in the 80s, my auntie was actually a video pirate. So back then was like, VHS tapes. So she had this room full of...
in the age of physical media.
Yeah, physical media.
We had to transport them around in things.
So imagine physical media pirates. Yeah, so back then...
Yeah, that's really hardcore because you need the machines as well. You need the space. The electricity, wow.
So the point of me telling this story is because back then the hot programs in Singapore are those drama series from Hong Kong, the TVB dramas. So I have a lot of access to these shows. And as we all know, these dramas are all in Cantonese. So I grew up I spoke 3 languages growing up, but I was in an environment where I was constantly surrounded by 4 languages. I mean, English, Mandarin, Hokkien, which I spoke, and Cantonese,
which is the language of the Hong Kong, where it was mostly made.
And that would also kind of like influence me because of the shows and the stories in these shows.
Yeah, likewise, I picked up a bit of Cantonese by listening and watching some of these drama serials growing up. I'd like to ask you, how did your interest in Chinese history begin? But before I do so, I could unpack a little bit about why my interest in Chinese history began. So it's not particularly a story I'm proud of because I work in the field of media and communication. I teach it for a living, so I know, what it means to have popular culture influence a person. However, I fell for it. I think it was back in 2007, I went to watch a film in a cinema with my mom, and it was called 霍元甲, or Fearless. I think that was the English title.
The Jet Li movie, right?
Yeah, the Jet Li movie. This hyper stylized representation of the Chinese century of humiliation. That brought me into this deep dive, having studied it for the last decade or so and having traveled to China on this mission to document the ethnicities. So I'm mindful that I have both Chinese programming and some of its DNA within me, but at the same time, I also have this British post-colonial censors and filter working at the same time when I read, write, converse, and think.
Actually, that's interesting. I guess that goes for most of us of this generation. Like for myself, the same with you. I grew up with mostly Western influences, although the language I spoke was, by both sides of the language. I spoke both, but most of the influences I grew up with was Western. Like we were into Guns N' Roses, Metallica.
Music, like so much of the things going through our ears.
Yeah, I was deeply into Jim Morrison and the Doors and the whole counterculture thing going on in the West. Although we were like 20 years late or 30 years late. But somehow, just like you, the older we grew, the older we got, the more interested we became in tracing back to our own roots. I guess the only difference between you and me in this respect is that I had easier access as compared to your case.
That's such an important point because going to the school that I went to, you would never use the language unless it's absolutely necessary. Only in class, and in every single interaction, it's all in English. And the little Mandarin or Chinese I spoke was with my mom at home. And growing up, the amount of full sentences you construct with a parent, despite the fact I actually spoke to her in Mandarin, but it was really just nouns and things yeah, and the majority of that is sound effects, right?
Yeah.
Rather than actually being competent in language. So a film triggered my journey. How about yourself?
I was talking about my auntie's giant video collection.
Yeah.
So
how giant is this, man? Like, are we talking about like
let's
the
put it
entire
this way.
wall? Yeah.
To our audience that are overseas, they might not understand this, but between you and me, let me give you an illustration. You know the old 3-room flats in Singapore, right?
Yes, okay. Mentally constructing it.
Yeah. So one of the rooms, the common room that's facing the corridor, the one entire wall of it is filled up with VCRs.
Oh wow. Okay.
And
so that would be approximately 4 meters or thereabouts.
Yeah, 13 to 15 feet across that wall. Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
And then the width of a typical VHS tape is like what?
No. I mean VCR recorders. That whole wall VCR recorders. And that is where we slot in all the tapes and record from the master tape, we'll record down and then take it out. And then if you're talking about the tapes themselves, I seriously can't give you an answer. Because it will be mind-blowing the numbers. Yeah. Anyway, so back then there was this whole Kung Fu movie and Kung Fu series craze. I don't think that really went away until like the late 90s. But so I was exposed to a lot of these shows. Like yourself, you said it was the movie Fearless. So for me, it was these dramas, and back then the Return of the Condor Heroes, 神雕侠侣.
Oh wow, 神雕侠侣.
1983. I was 4 years old.
I think I've seen that on TV. I must have. Yeah.
There's been 1,000,001 remakes since like the 70s.
This is a classic, would you say?
Yeah, it is a classic. Yeah. It is a classic. So the 1983 version came into Singapore a bit late. I think 84, 85 or something. And by the time I watched it, and it was on TV as well, it was even later. The Andy Lau version, to me, the definitive version. Okay, don't argue with me. Whoever you are out there, don't tell me Huang Xiaoming, don't tell me Hu Tianle, don't tell me Louis Koo. Andy Lau's version, okay? That's the definitive one.
Make up your minds.
So I also caught up with it, and it was such a hot and popular show. Anyone who had watched it in our generation at that time. So from that show, my father, being a avid reader, although he did not receive much formal education, my father was a very avid reader. He told me that, this show actually came from a novel, came from a series of books. And I was like, serious? So where can I find these books? And back then I was off like 10, 11 years old at that time, around there. And so he was like, yeah, these are books. And I remember that they actually had this serialization of the novel in the Chinese papers at that time. And so every day, my father had a habit of, buying papers like all our fathers. And so every day
I remember buying the Chinese papers for my parents as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Even though I couldn't read it, I was just like, okay, go and get it. I'll go get it.
So I got the paper and I started reading, the serialization on the papers. And that's how I got started with this novel. And, a couple of years later, when I was like, 12 or 13, somewhere around there, I went to these secondhand bookshops, and back then you could rent books. So I rented the entire set of the books and I started reading. And that's where this whole thing, caught on. And I realized, these books were written by Jin Yong or Louis Cha. Mention Jin Yong to any Chinese person and they'll know who he is. And Louis Cha. By right, I should call him Dr. Cha now. Bless his soul, he passed away a couple of years back. So Dr. Cha wrote a series of 14 or 16 novels, all in the wuxia genre. Wuxia, if you don't know, for our audience out there, is like martial arts, kung fu, fighting, set in ancient China. And one thing special about Dr. Charles' books is that his books were mostly, I think with the exception of one or two of his stories, all of them were set in real historical settings. And the Condor Hero series was set from the Southern Song until the Yuan Dynasty period, with a lot of historical events thrown in as a backdrop of these stories. And that's when I started getting like really into this whole Chinese history thing. Yeah, like, oh, so, this character
Triggered.
was, and there was even a political, like pseudo-political plot points, like, the bad guys were with the Mongolians that were coming in to invade China, and all that stuff. So it really triggered my young, impressionable mind at that time. Like, so what really happened? What really happened? I have to go and find out. And that's where this
like Mythbusters, is this true or false?
Yeah. So what were the real events and what were the fictional parts? And that's where I started, digging. And of course, back then, before the age of the internet, it was extremely difficult to get a lot of this information.
Physical media. Oh.
Yeah, the age of physical media, man. For those of you that were born after the 2000s, my God, you should have lived through the physical media.
When collections would take up physical space all around you. If you lose it, it's gone forever, mate.
Look at that. Look at that.
Yep. Physical media.
And so that was one part of it. Another part of it is like, and a lot of our friends know that I started martial arts training at a very young age. I started at 8 years old. And
which school of martial art was that?
I mean, I started as with most Singaporeans in Taekwondo. So
same Taekwondo.
Yeah, everyone, like most of the kids of our age would take Taekwondo
it's
classes.
An interesting choice. Yeah.
It was accessible and affordable. I mean, you pay like what, $10-20 back then per month, and then you train in an open basketball court, like on a half court back then. Not like now you have these Korean instructors and the nice air-conditioned gyms.
It used to be on some random basketball court. But I'm thankful for the Taekwondo training though. It made me quite flexible. Remember we spent as much time stretching as actually in any kind of like physical. It's crazy. They bring back memories now.
Believe it or not, thanks to that, I got unsprainable ankles now.
Unsprainable because of the flying kicks.
All the stretching and the kicks and everything. But anyways, we digress. Martial arts but from Taekwondo, I moved to learn this traditional Shaolin Chinese martial arts in this rooftop wuguan thing, rooftop martial arts.
Rooftop. Wow.
Like you okay, for those who are into the whole martial arts culture thing, they will understand.
That's like the iconic location.
Yeah, like when you watch these old Hong Kong movies, they have this like, set in the 60s and the 70s.
Archetypal setting.
Oh yeah, if you watch the Ip Man movies, like they train on the rooftop. Exactly that.
Long shot, then zooming in.
So in Singapore, we have a lot of that, down the whole stretch of Geylang, we have a lot of these schools. So I was in one of those schools. And of course, when you are training in one of those schools, you start doing lion dance and dragon dance as well. And so I got involved in that. And we took part in national competitions and of course the usual shop openings, Chinese New Year performances and all those. So we did. And this like further entwined me and my life with Chinese traditions and Chinese culture.
Because now you're shifting from just consuming to practicing it. It's part of your day.
From just being an observer and a student of that history, that culture, I'm also being exposed and being a part of the culture and the tradition as it has evolved into modern day. And so that basically covers like my life up to like what, in my teens, my late teens, 18, 19. So yeah, I did all that by the time I was like 18 or 19. And by the 20s, that was when you started having internet and stuff like that, and I'm out of the formal education system. As you know, I did not really go through the whole education system in Singapore, so I did a lot of self-study, and I was free in a way to pursue whatever topic that interests me. And so Chinese history was one very big thing. Chinese history and tradition and culture was a very big thing in my life, and I pursued that. And yeah, the rest, as they say, is history. And now I'm a storyteller on YouTube about Chinese history and Chinese stories. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing. And here we are. And films and literature seem to be a very common shared experience with the wider Chinese diaspora reconnecting with China. So a major reason why this podcast was an idea that sat in my head for a while and now I'm bringing it to life is because of a book, When China Reconnects. In it, the question is posed, China's Fourth Rise. Now in the book, Professor Wang Gongwu explains China's fourth rise since the Qin unification and the four perspectives that shaped his understanding and approach to China. As a boy who was brought up in Malaya to live in China, as a student of historiography, who also learned about Western sinology or Hanxue. Third, as someone who was fascinated by how contemporary China looked to the past for lessons. And fourth, as an observer of China's rise after a great fall. A number of ideas in the book stuck in my head, such as what Professor Wang alluded to, in that China has learned about 85 to 90% from the West, but the remaining 10% they have rejected. To the Chinese mind, those 90% will pursue and master and be better than the West if possible. But the 10% we can do without it, we'll drop it. In an attempt to decode the Chinese model, it is arguably useful to look closely at its past experience, the ebbs and flows of its dynasties to figure out what they may do next. So Api, ready to resume our conversation from last week?
Definitely. But before that, I have to make a slight correction on what I said last week. Apparently, a brain fart happened live. So when we were talking about the mandate of heaven, I translated it as I think I said 天心 or something. So the correct term should be 天命. So what happened was that I was trying to two things was happening in my mind at the same time. I was trying to say the mandate of heaven equals to the will of people. That means 天命即民心, and somehow I mashed those two together and said 天心 instead. So yeah, that's a little correction. So if any of you caught, 天命, the mandate of heaven. So if any of you caught on that, yeah, you're right. I was wrong. Yeah. I made a mistake. So sorry about that.
Can I quickly just pause you there for a second? Because I'd like to unpack this a bit more.
Yeah.
Because one of the books, actually, I lie. It was a game that got me interested in the book in the first place, which was, the game was called Ancient Bandits of China or something like that. And related to 水浒传.
Yeah.
And one of the banners that the bandits would carry was like this 替天行道.
Oh, yeah.
That is set in the Song Dynasty, would that be correct? Which we'll talk about and elaborate a bit
that
later.
Was the 水浒传, if I'm not wrong, is a Northern Song Dynasty, if I'm not wrong.
Northern Song.
Yeah, okay. If I'm not wrong.
Yeah. So I'm guessing, so this idea has a long lineage to carry out the mandate of heaven. So how far back would this idea go?
Mandate of heaven was established by Zhou Wu Wang, King Wu of Zhou. So Zhou dynasty, when he established the first official dynasty of China, 1046 BC, like I mentioned in the previous episode. So mandate of heaven came from 1046 BC, and until today. I mean,
so
look at it this
back,
way.
It's like 3,000 years.
Yeah,
this idea is still strong.
Look at it this way. Even our government in Singapore, every election they will say the same thing. You have an idea what I will say already. You know, we have the mandate of the people because they voted for us. So same idea, mandate of heaven, mandate of people, will of people is
semantically the equivalent, but they've just dressed it up. Anyway, another topic for another conversation.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So this will go back 1046 BC,
yes,
you say?
Yes, 1046. So, anyways, interesting point that you brought up about Dr. Wang's book just now, where you mentioned that the Chinese people would say we want to learn 90% from the West and be better if possible, and the remaining 10% we most probably don't need it and don't want it, which kind of like reminds me of a topic that we spoke about last week, which was when we were speaking about centralized government and centralized power. And this statement by Dr. Wang kind of reminds me of that. It kind of fits in. I believe that part of this 10% that the Chinese people do not want is the governing system of the West. They would rather have a more centralized governing system, a more centralized power, because, like I said last week, which I will reiterate now, that it is a very unpopular take to most people, because most people will think that centralized power is not a good thing. I do agree with that to a certain extent, but we cannot just be so one-sided in our view. I believe there are pros and cons to every situation and every system. So to expand a bit on what I spoke about regarding this centralized power, it is the most efficient way of governing. It is the most efficient way.
Efficient and stable, would you say?
Efficient and stable, and because there's centralized government, centralized power, these people could take a very long-term view. They could make extremely long-term plans for the people and for the state, or for whatever organization. So, for example, the government can take an extremely long view, like we said last week, longitudinal view. They can take a very long view, and they can take a very high view of the entire picture and form policies that will go for 20, 30 years. And that is usually the time frame you need to complete any kind of massive projects, or you want to accomplish some kind of massive goals. And the problem why the Western model, for want of a better word, one of the main problems is that it is almost impossible to make such long-term plans, because let's face it, facts are facts. Let's face it, okay? One ruling or governing term is what, 4-5 years, and a lot of these systems have an inbuilt limit of 2 terms or 3 terms if you are lucky. So what happens is that, number one, the longest time you have would be what, 8 years, 10 years, or if you're unlucky, you have 4 to 5 years. And the thing is, because you have such a short time horizon to work with, it is virtually impossible for anyone to envision a 30-year plan or 20-year plan or 40-year plan. So rather than worry about this 30, 40, 50 years problem, they would rather take a very short-term view and see what is the fastest way to get some benefits, and in some cases make themselves look good in the eyes of people, hopefully to get another to be re-elected for another term. And so this short-term mindset, this short-term mentality, I mean, it is a very huge detriment to the evolution and the progress of society. That is my personal opinion, by the way. Because let's put it this way, even if this person can make a long-term plan, why would he want to do it? Because by the time the benefits of these long-term plans manifest themselves, it would be under the term of another person, of another leader. Why should I be doing something for the benefit of someone else who might not even be from the same party, or might be my opponent, might be my rival? So I mean, let's face it, this is human nature at work. I mean, we can talk about the ideal situation, but how often do we see ideal situations playing out in real life?
Yeah,
I mean,
and also we will need to add into the discussion and the mix, question of scale.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Questions of topography, geography, weather systems, such as the rainfall map that we said we're going to bring up last week, but we forgot.
Yes.
Because the circumstances that have shaped China today, right, has a lot to do with its access to feeding its people. So, Api, if I could hand the time over to you to unpack this for us a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so you were talking about the environmental and the climate reasons, the climate uniqueness of China's situation. So this is a side-by-side comparison of the rainfall map and the map of the Great Wall of China. And as we all know, the Great Wall of China basically has been there since, 200 BC and before that. Yeah. So what happens if we look at this map? You will see that the amount of rainfall and the Great Wall actually coincides with each other. North of the wall, like in this picture, Inner Mongolia, is where we start to get very little rainfall. And this is basically the northern steppes that we always talk about. And south of that wall, we have areas that enjoy relatively good climate. And the further south you go, the more rainfall you get. And so this is basically kind of like a dividing line of two types of civilization. In the south, we have the agrarian and agricultural societies. And to the north, where there's very little rainfall, they could only lead a nomadic lifestyle. And obviously, these people in the north will lead a very, very harsh life with very little access to resources. So what does this tell us? This tells us that in a way, the Central Plains civilization or the Chinese civilization from ancient history, from all the way back in the days, would always be trying to defend themselves from the raiders from the north. I mean, before there were the Mongolians, before there were the Jurchens, before there were the Tanguts or the Khitans, there were the Huren, or some historians actually say they were actually the ancestors of the Huns that the Western civilization met much later in history. But apparently they originated here in this part of the world. And they will always sweep down south to raid the more resource-rich civilization for food, for people, for stuff that they need to survive. And therefore, the early Chinese people started to build this great wall in a bid to stop the barbarians at the wall, basically.
I've been to the wall, and it's such a mind-boggling piece of engineering. It's on some of the steepest and most heinous of terrains, but oh my word, it's quite a feat. And to commit such resources to actually get it built and connected, of course, because there were multiple walls in the beginning, before they were formally put together.
Yes, originally they were city walls of the Warring States period cities, the northernmost cities of the Warring States period. So what happened was when Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor, unified China, he kind of linked up these various sections of these northern city walls into the first Great Wall of China, basically. But the wall you see today, that the ones that you visited, is actually what we call the Ming Dynasty Wall. So basically, the Great Wall of China we see today is repaired and reconstructed during the Ming Dynasty, if I'm not wrong, during the 1400s. So yeah, that's another trivial, another story and a half. So in answer to your question, we were talking about the unique situation that China finds itself in throughout history. This was something that no other civilization, I would say, would have to face, that they always had a constant threat to their north. And they did their best, they tried their best, even from the Zhou dynasty onwards. They always had to defend themselves from these northern invaders and these northern raiders. And this would happen all the way until even up to the Qing dynasty in the 1800s. We still have they still have this problem. and the biggest mass invasion from the north will come during the Han Dynasty, late Han Dynasty, and the northern and southern dynasties period that I spoke about in last week's episode. So the thing is, this climate, people would not have realized that climate actually play a bigger role in the evolution of civilizations and culture. It plays such a big role in the evolution of civilization and culture, and most people might not even have noticed it to begin with. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights. Last week, you spoke about this very thing, the assimilation of the northern steppes. Right. From my travels to China, even in a specific location like Yunnan, I'll encounter so many different ethnicities. It's pretty mind-boggling. So Chinese civilization, I like to make the argument, is not as homogeneous as one might think. Would you agree with such a statement?
Yeah, of course. I mean, with what's the population of China now?
1.4. Hashtag do your own research. I'm not sure what the latest number is, but it's approximately 1.4.
Yeah, 1.4 billion. You can't expect 1.4 billion to be homogeneous.
It's
impossible. That's what a quarter of the world's population.
1.4 different stories.
Yeah,
lives led.
I mean,
in different
if we
places.
Take a bigger view of it, we can't have 1.4 billion people believing in the same thing, following the same traditions, and having the same culture. I mean, generally, maybe they have similarities, but of course, there will be differences. But for China's case, or the Chinese people's case, one very obvious thing that I'm sure you would have noticed on your travels, or you don't even have to travel. I'm in Singapore, I can even notice that, is that there is a very, very obvious difference between the northerners and the southerners. Right?
Could you elaborate on that? Yep. I have my own thoughts on this, but I'd love to hear your side of the story.
I mean, apart from the fact that they actually, if you look close enough, they actually look kind of different. Like I mentioned to you in a previous conversation that, we can sit down at a coffee shop and I'll look at the people and I'll say that that's a northerner, that's a southerner. They have these features that are quite prominent if you know what you're looking at. But I digress. The thing is, China's development, the Chinese civilization's development, the Chinese people's development actually happened, I won't say isolated from each other in bits and pieces, but the specific regions would have developed in very specific ways. For example, the two biggest blocks of development would be the North and the South, the Yellow River civilization and the Yangtze River culture. So what happened is back even during the Zhou dynasty, before we even get to the spring and autumn, which was about 700 BC, before even that, right at almost at the beginning of the foundation of the Zhou dynasty, we are talking about 1000 BC or 900 plus BC, we have the formation of the state of Chu, which was in the south, and they were slowly move even further south to colonize the entirety of the Yangtze River region. And mind you, at that time, the geography of the area is very different from today. Back then, the south, the Yangtze River region, is actually a whole series of marshlands and floodplains. Not like today, we have dry land and flat plains around the area now. Back then, it was marshlands and floodplains. And if I could pull up a small map of the Chu kingdom. So what happened, as you can see, this is the entirety of the Chu kingdom towards the end of the Warring States period. This would be around the 300 BC, 300 plus BC era. And this whole patch, what happened during the Zhou dynasty was that the Yellow River civilizations did not really recognize the Chu people as equals. From the Zhou court itself, from the Zhou royal court itself, the Chu people was always looked upon as kind of like semi-savages. They were like uncivilized people, semi-civilized people to the other people of the Central Plains at that time. So what happened? I guess partly out of spite, and partly a sign of their tenacity, they kind of like assimilated part of the Central Plains cultures and developed the rest on their own. So they developed very differently from the rest of the Zhou dynasty, the other kingdoms of the Zhou period. And the literature, the writing, the language, everything was so different, even back then, from 300 over BC. And that difference actually continued all the way throughout the centuries and millennia until, very recently. Even until today, the northerners will look at the southerners and say that, they are soft and they are shrewd, for want of a better word. And the southerners will look at the northerners and say that they are rough but straightforward.
So they'll see each other as the other, right? A way to distinguish themselves is this is how we do things, and this is how the South does things.
Yes, yes, exactly. The North, of course, nowadays the differences in their mind is not as drastic. It's not as pronounced as back in the day, but to have that mindset even today, just imagine how long did all these stereotypes
the memory,
it is so becoming ingrained. Like a genetic memory already. Northerners, they are big, they are bulky, and they are like North versus South is like what we said previously. Is like if you play the RPG, it's like you are looking at the barbarian class, the tanks.
Yeah, we are the civilized. This civilization, that's the barbarians.
Or the if you play RPG, the tanks, the barbarians versus
they'll physically have that
rooks.
line as well.
Yeah. So something like that. So that is the main dividing line already for North versus South, and that is like homogeneous. Hardly, hardly. Just the North and the South who have these differences. And you've mentioned before that there are 56 races in total in China today. So North and South alone, there's already this big difference. 56 different races with their own cultures and traditions. How can it be homogeneous? Of course, on the very macro scale, we are all Chinese. We identify with the Chinese people. We identify as Chinese. But what Chinese are you? Like even in Singapore, between you and me, you will identify as a Chinese Teochew. I would identify as a Chinese Hokkien. Even the dialects we speak, although close, are very different. And the
spoken language, the culture, the practices, the variations as well.
Like we also have our own stereotypes of each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, can't remember the saying off the top of my head. But there are still stereotypes, even though our ancestral homes are so close to each other. We're practically neighbors. Our ancestors were practically neighbors, but we still have stereotypes about each other. And much more so when we are talking about 1.4 billion people spread over this massive landmass that takes up like half a continent maybe, or a quarter of a continent. So the Chinese people are not as homogeneous as people think. It's just like you can't use the term Asia or just call someone Asian. What's Asian? Asian could be Japanese, could be Korean, could be Chinese, could
That's
be
one of the broadest strokes you could paint.
Yeah, and then the next...
just have to look at the map. There's a lot of countries in there, and they're all in different locations and different geophysical, political circumstances.
Exactly. So, and then even if you scale it down a little bit and you say, that's a Chinese. Okay, generally, we are Chinese. But the thing is, not all Chinese are the same. There are, like you mentioned, there are 56 different races in Chinese. And the latest one to be assimilated into the Chinese race, I believe, would be the Manchurians. After the fall of the last imperial dynasty, where the Manchurians got assimilated and took on Chinese names as well. I mean, I think I mentioned this to you in our previous conversation. The royal imperial house of the Qing dynasty, the Aishingoro family, actually dropped their name and took on Chinese names. A lot of them took on the surname Jing today. So yeah, they got assimilated, but that happened what? In the early 1900s, 1912, 1913. So that's how recent the latest race was assimilated into being a Chinese. But having said that, one point I would like to make in regards to this about being Chinese, what defines a Chinese, is also broader than most people would think. Being Chinese is not about the color of your skin, the color of your eyes, and stuff like that. Being Chinese is actually more about the values that you follow, the traditions that you follow. You don't have to look like a Chinese to be a Chinese. It goes back to this whole collective acceptance mindset that the Chinese people have. And I believe, my personal opinion is that this is the exact uniqueness of the Chinese mindset that allowed it to be the longest surviving non-broken civilization in human history, because they do not differentiate based on skin color or where you come from. They differentiate based on your culture, your tradition, and your values. That is why anyone who tried to invade China, any foreign races that try to invade China, like we say just now, the northern steppe tribes, when they invade China, what end up happening to them? They become Chinese. They become Sinicized. Doesn't matter you are Tange, doesn't matter you are Khitan, doesn't matter you are Jurchen. You come into this land, and then slowly you realize that, these people got a better way of doing things. Maybe we should do things their way. And slowly over time, over decades, over centuries, over millennia, suddenly there's no more Tangas. Suddenly there's no more Khitans. Suddenly there's no more Jurchens. They all became Chinese. They even took on Chinese names, and they intermarried with the locals, and their offsprings, became Sinicized.
Yeah, it's a system to enable long-term projects, right?
Yeah,
That's one way to think
you
of
want
it.
to talk about long-term projects. This is like, how long does it take to like really assimilate an entire people? Like really?
Yeah,
So,
I wrote about this before. I kind of likened Chinese culture with being the Borg of Star Trek, assimilating other alien life forms, at least in that television series, was what they were best at. And I feel that that may be the case as well with the Chinese assimilation.
Yeah, it's the Chinese are generally very.
They project power in a very different way.
Yeah, like I said previously, they do not seek to colonize; they only seek to be recognized.
So can we just get that one more time? They do not seek to be colonized.
They do not seek to colonize.
They do not seek to colonize.
They only seek to be recognized.
Only seek to be recognized.
And by recognize, I mean you recognize their rights and their way of life. They just want to be recognized that this is how we do things. This is what we do. We want to be recognized for that, and we want our ways to be respected. And that's the whole Chinese thing. As long as you don't overstep your boundary, if you like what we do, you are very welcome to join us. That's the very, very Chinese thing. Just follow the house rules. You come to my place, you are respectful, and you recognize my position in this place, then I'm fine with it. I mean, basically, it's common courtesy and common etiquette. You don't go into someone else's house and tell them how to do things.
So has this been a pattern that you've noticed in your study of Chinese history?
It's exactly that. When a foreign people goes into China, be it as an invader or as an ambassador or what have you, if they recognize and respect the Chinese people, they end up, benefiting from it, and they end up. Being Sinicized or not is up to their own individual preference, but for sure, any foreign invader that step onto Chinese soil and be aggressive and hostile, yes, they might be a dominant force for maybe a few decades. maybe even a few centuries, but over the long term, inevitably, they will either get sinicized, willing or not, or they will be driven out. It's just a very natural progression. That's why the Chinese people always have this very long-term view, and sometimes to the point where you feel like, it looks like they don't really even care. Because to the Chinese people, it's like, yeah, we've been here 3,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago. We'll still be here 3,000 years, 4,000 years down the road. So whatever happens in the next 10 years, 20 years, it's just a blip in history. It's just a minor blip. Just a small deviation from the norm. So like we said last week, if we take a longitudinal view, when we look at a very long time horizon, really anything that happens within Chinese history are like basically blips. It always self-corrects itself into the median or the mean. History always self-corrects. Whatever history it is, it always self-corrects. But in terms of Chinese history, the self-correction is even more obvious, that you can really see it like tangibly if you draw a chart or a graph.
So what do you think that self-corrects to? What is this place of equilibrium? Finding it difficult to pronounce that word. Equilibrium.
Yeah. I guess in a way, Confucius would have put it very well, the middle path, 中庸之道. So 中庸 is like you are not overbearing, like you do not impose yourself on others, be it your neighbors, be it, basically you don't impose your ideas on others. But at the same time, you do not allow others to impose their will on you. Like a bamboo. That's why the Chinese love the bamboo plant so much. The bamboo plant does not impose itself on anyone. But at the same time, no matter how strong the wind or the storm, the bamboo plant would never break. It would just topple, and then over like next couple of years, spring back up. It will be growing again.
Yeah.
So that is like the Chinese backbone, basically. The bamboo plant is kind of like a Chinese backbone. And the Chinese do not seek to impose themselves. They do not seek to impose them. They know what they are, they know who they are, and they are just going to do things their way. And they know that ultimately, whatever they set out to do, they will be able to achieve it. And that is backed by that is back where their confidence come from. Their confidence come from the fact that for a few thousand years, almost every civilization in the world has tried to impose themselves on these people, and none of them has succeeded. It always self-corrects back to the direction that the Chinese people want to take.
Abi, last week we spoke a lot about your favorite dynasty, but not as much on your least favorite. We briefly touched on Confucian reform, and Confucianism, I think, is something we were exposed to in our Singaporean education system. I must say I don't know a lot about it, but thank you so much for highlighting it to me last week. And you kind of alluded to how this Confucian reform had placed a mental straitjacket on Chinese people. But was there a tangible effect on the Song dynasty itself?
Definitely. I mean, imagine if this reform can cause an effect on our entire civilization for 1,000 years, that until today we cannot shake off their mental straitjacket.
A mental programming that's just locked in.
Yeah, it's like it's there. From the moment you're born a Chinese, you have this mental cage on you, for want of a better word. Imagine if this is still happening today in year 2022. Imagine the impact that it would have had on the people back in the Song dynasty when it was first implemented, with a very political what do you call that, reason, a very political what's that word I'm trying to find? Never mind, a political reason. It's a political thing that made this reform happen. So I mentioned last week that Zhao Kuang-yin, the founder of the Song dynasty, rose to power through a revolt. I think a better way of putting it would be usurpation. He usurped the throne from a young king, so he usurped the throne of his rightful liege. And after that, being a general himself, he realized that maybe I should do something to prevent another military revolt or usurpation from happening again. And therefore, I mean, this was before the Confucian Reformation, but this would have laid the foundation and the groundwork. It would have a significant impact on the Reformation that happened later. So what happened is that Zhao Kuang-yin basically took away all the authority and power from the military branch of the government. So all the generals and the military men, they all lose their power and authority. There's a very famous event called 杯酒释兵权, which basically what happened was that the emperor, Zhao Kuang-yin, hosted this feast for all his generals, who all of them fought with him. From the early days, from day one, most of them followed him into battle after battle and fought with him until he stabilized and built the Song dynasty. And what happened was in this feast, they had a drink and, talk about the good old days. And it was at this feast that Zhao Kuang-yin basically just casually mentioned that, yeah, maybe it's not such a good idea that all of you are holding so much power in your hands. These are all his old friends and his comrades in arms, and with a drink, he relieved all of them of their authority and power. And what happened was that after that, the central court system underwent a very massive change. What happened was that the scholar class, the literati, for some context, back in the days, the scholars, the governors, the people who use the brush, or as we say today, the people who hold the pen, are a very different class from the people who hold the swords, the military men. So there was a very stark and obvious divide between these two classes of people. It was already
so would you say it's a hierarchy?
No, I mean, before that, they were still equal back then. Okay, you are the military man, you have your duties, you go fight the wars and everything. We are the scholar class, we are the ones that come up with policies, we are the one that govern and administer to the land. And so they each have their own realms where they work. So what happened after this relieving of the duties of these military men during the early Song dynasty was that the scholar class was put above the military class. So now it becomes a hierarchy, like you mentioned. So now the military people are a rank lower than the scholar class. So, and people will say that, well, that doesn't seem like much of a problem, does it? The thing is, these kind of things, you don't see the problems immediately. It really manifests itself when you least expect it, especially over time. And so after the first emperor of the Song dynasty passed away, his brother came to power, and some say it was usurping again, but that's another story and a half. What happened was that it got worse and worse because under his brother, if I'm not wrong, was when this will sound very, very ridiculous, but I'm not making this up. Before the army sets out into battle, before they set out on a campaign, the battle formation is already fixed by the emperor. So it doesn't matter what situation you go into. The emperor say that this is the battle formation you have to fight on, you have to fight with when you're out on the field.
And you have to comply 100%.
You have to comply. You can't do anything different, okay?
Right.
And what happens is with every army, the imperial court will send a scholar or one of those wenguan, the scholar class. They will follow them as jianjun, that means the inspector of the army. And this fella, although he doesn't belong in the chain of command of the military, but he basically holds far greater power than the commander-in-chief on the ground in the battlefield.
Because he is reporting directly to the emperor.
Yes, he is basically the emperor's representative in the
will convey the information.
Yes. And so in the beginning, I mean, yeah, people will say that, oh, this sounds like a good system. I mean, checks and balance, the general cannot revolt because there's someone.
So would the reports come through this individual or through the generals?
It all goes through the individual. And
so now you see distills and filters into one source.
And now you see the problem already. So imagine if there's a situation where the general and this inspector of the army are rivals, political rivals, or something along those lines.
Only one voice is heard.
Yes, there will only be one voice. There are exceptions where certain generals who are really well known or whatever, they can 直接上奏 to report directly to the emperor, but those are very, very minority. So what happens is that now you have a person that basically spent his entire life studying the Confucian classics and writing poems or writing lyrics, his entire life, and knowing nuts about what goes on in the military, nuts about even which way to point the sword or whatever. And this guy is actually holding more power in the military over the general in the battlefield. When you have this situation going on, is there any surprise that the Song military will lose battle after battle? And to top off this whole farce, right? The emperor is actually the one that fixed the battle formation for the military before they even set off, much less, depending on the situation. And if they want to make any changes, they have to report all the way back, ask for permission to make the changes. And we all know the battlefield moves in a split second. So by the time the reports and the permission back and forth, the timing is already off. So things can't get done. And this is the opposite end of the scale when you have a centralized power that is too centralized. You can't move. Like you say, it's totally too bulky to move already. And all this stems from a very paranoid royal house.
So they were completely encumbered by bureaucracy.
Yes, Song Dynasty's bureaucracy is crazy. The amount of bureaucracy, I mean, if we talk about bureaucracy today, we all joke about the red tapes, bureaucracy, inefficiencies. Yeah, try living in a Song dynasty, then you know what is bureaucracy, because everything is crazy strict. And this whole situation would also breed a culture of this literati class, the scholar class. Now that, fighting, basically you don't need to die when you fight because you can't cut people up, Oh yeah, before I go into that, the penalty for changing your battle formation on the ground before asking for permission is execution.
Wow, okay.
Yeah. So
was this happening when the Song dynasty was starting to collapse? When did this shift?
This was happening all the way from the mid-northern Song all the way until the end of until the southern Song. I mean, we all know as Chinese, we know the story about the General Yue Fei, who fought off the northern invaders. One of the greatest generals in Chinese history. Imagine how great he is that he was able to win all his battles and all his campaigns while working under this system. But in the end, he still got done in by the bureaucracy. So there's that. I mean, even him, the greatest general in Chinese history, was done in by the bureaucracy. Like, you can't make this up. You can't make this up. So, yeah, what I was saying is that, this was just part of it. The whole Confucian reform, because it created such a strict caste. I use this very loosely when it created this strict caste system in society. And the scholar class now, have power in their hands. And once they have power in their hands, what do they want? They want more power and more benefits for themselves. And so what happened? It bred a culture of political infighting. So now yes, the Song dynasty did get rid of the threat of military revolts and military uprisings within their own realm. But what they got instead was very, very serious political factions and political infighting within the central court itself. When you have that stuff going on and you have such a centralized system of governance, can you imagine the chaos that is causing?
When it gets factional, each faction actually could have wield a lot of power and a lot of resources.
Now that the generals are in effect kind of like a rung lower than the scholar class, and this scholar class have their own factions. So what happened is that some generals, to advance their own careers, would tie their own fates and hug the ties of some of these very powerful officials in court. And now you have political infighting, and then you have the soldiers under them. Of course, it did not explode into like the Song army fighting the Song army. But what happened is that, why do they keep losing against the Jurchens? Why do they keep losing against the Khitans? Because when they went out on campaigns, of course, one military campaign is not one army. You have a few armies moving out a full campaign into a theater of war. So they go out, fight against this enemy that's not invading them. So this army goes out, they are the vanguard. And then the other army that's supposed to support them belongs to another faction. And they go like, nah, let them die. We are not going to help them. Why should we help our political rivals? Let them wear each other out. Then we come in, we pick up the pieces. So you have this mentality going on. It's worse than infighting. They are literally a very good example. The Song, their entire dream was to take back the Yan Yun 16州, which is around today's Beijing area. So the entirety of the Song dynasty, they never managed to recover that piece of land. And the closest they got, basically, I won't even call it the closest. One of their attempts, after they signed a treaty with the Jurchens, the Jing dynasty, after they signed a treaty with Jurchens, one of their terms was that, okay, I tell you what, let me pull this up. So this was basically the early Northern Song period. This piece is the Jurchens, and this was the Khitans, and this was the Tanguts. They were the original northern dominant force, and they were pushed westward by the Khitans, and the Khitans were the dominant force in the early Northern Song dynasty days. What happened was that this piece of land would be today's Beijing area, and the Jurchens were basically vassals of the Khitans until they revolted. And the Song people, sign a treaty with the Jurchens, say, okay, you take the north and the east of this, the original Khitan Empire. We will sweep up from the south and take the southern part of it. So what happened is that during the Northern Song, they sent 200,000 men, Song army, to invade what is today's Beijing area, to try to take it back. 200,000 Song soldiers went up against, I think, less than 100,000 Khitan soldiers. Routed, like totally routed and broken. Totally routed. Like they outnumber the opponents by more than 2-1. Some say they outnumber them like 3-1 or 4-1, and they were totally routed. At the most insulting thing is when the Jurchens came out from the Heilongjiang region, that's where they came out from. They swept through the entire north with 20,000 men. 20,000 men took the whole north. And the Southern Song, with all its resources, all its riches, biggest economy in the world, 200,000 men went up north. I think almost none of them came back. And why did that happen? Because of this political factioning and everything. Partly because of this Confucianism of that time, the politicized version of Confucianism that plays a very strict system of hierarchy, and these generals are only following whatever their lords, their superior officers are telling them to do. And so you have 200,000 men. Yes, on paper it looks very good, but the thing is, these 200,000 men are all fighting for themselves. They are not fighting for a common goal. 200,000 men, maybe 3, 4, 5 different armies. One army go up, everyone else waiting for them to die because it's from a different faction. And is there a tangible effect because of this confusion reform? Yes, this is a very one of the very visceral effect of how that kind of mindset and that social stratification caused this political factionizing and this political splintering that really destroyed the Song dynasty from within, rather than say the Song dynasty was destroyed by the Jurchens or by the Tangas or by the Khitans, or technically they were destroyed by the Mongols. Rather than say that they were destroyed by these external people, they basically destroyed themselves from within with their philosophy and their ideology. So that was why I really, really, really don't like the Song dynasty. That's the main reason. It's like, come on, you had everything going for you, In the region, you are the dominant geopolitical power. You hold the majority of the resources of the land. You are the biggest, the biggest number in terms of population. You are the biggest economy in the world. And you can still screw it up so badly to lose basically every single war that you ever embarked on, and to finally just not disintegrate, to be like invaded and destroyed, as the dominant power is baffling. It's baffling how screwed up they were. Granted that literature, arts, and economy was the strongest that the Chinese civilization has seen since the Tang dynasty. The Song dynasty was the next golden age in terms of civil life and civilian life. It was a golden age, but politically, militarily, everything else, they just set themselves up to fail. And this to me is actually extremely ridiculous. It's like, why? I cannot understand. It's like that Jackie Chan meme picture, Yeah. So yeah, that's a very, very visceral and very tangible effect that this confusion reform, which basically is called, by the way, 朱熹变法。was it 朱熹变法? I have to double check again. Basically, the person who reformed the philosophy is this Confucian scholar called Zhu Xi. He is held up as a paragon of virtue by almost every scholar today. And this is my hot take. I really, really don't like him.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights, Abi. Yeah. If you could make some recommendations to our audiences, would there be any books or literature that you recommend them pick up to go find out more for themselves with regards to the Song dynasty?
Wow, Song dynasty. I mean, official histories would be pretty dry. I can tell you, the way Chinese write history, the official histories would be very dry. What do you want? You want something that's in a popular culture that like kind of like can ease you in before you.
Maybe you could make a suggestion for like step 1, and if you want to go deeper, where would you head after that?
Okay. If you want a more historical novel kind of version, you can try reading 水浒传, The Water Margin, which is the game that you played. Oh, by the way, for the viewers who don't know this, the name that you might know that game from, the other name for that game, when the Japanese made it, is called Suikoden. So yeah,
Because Japanese game.
yeah, Suikoden.
Japanese game on Chinese culture, that's also worth
Yeah,
looking deeper
Koi.
into.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
Koi.
the game that Bob has always referenced is Suikoden. So you can check that out. But it's
Suikoden.
based on this novel called 水浒传, the Water Margin. And if you want something like really hot-blooded with a lot of battles and a lot of wars and some political intrigue going on, you can go and read 岳飞传, which is
岳飞传.
which is the chronicles of General Yue
So they were set during the same time period. Close to the same.
Water Margin would be kind of like the
Later.
northern song, and Yue would be more to the southern song, early southern song. And yeah, you would read those stories and you would gnash your teeth together and you would hate the imperial court of that time, basically. And if you want something that's a bit more fictional, of course, you can go read the Condor Heroes trilogy by Dr. Louis Cha, 射雕英雄传, 神雕侠侣, and 倚天屠龙记. So the legend of the Condor Hero, the return of the Condor Hero, and the Heavenly Sword and the Dragon Saber. I believe that's the English translated titles of those books. And I believe the Legend of Condor Heroes have just received its official English translation a couple of years back. So still quite recent, although you can't find, basically you can hardly find a Chinese person that don't know about these novels. So these stories are set in the southern Song to the Yuan dynasty, from the southern Song to the fall of the Song dynasty until the Mongols came in. So it's fictional, of course. It's a wuxia or kung fu novel, so that could ease you in as well. So yeah, those are things that could ease you in. That's how I got into it, basically. Yeah. And a lot of these Chinese dramas nowadays, either from mainland or Hong Kong, a lot of them are actually set in the Song dynasty. So you could, yeah.
They make an interesting insight into different facets of Chinese life and ways of thinking and the different archetypes or personality traits that you find within the Chinese people. Like Water Margin, 水浒传 is made of 108 different heroes, if I'm not wrong. I hope I'm remembering correct.
It is.
The number correctly. 108条好汉. And each of them are so different. United in this cause to 替天行道, carry out.
To carry out the will of heaven.
I've got one final question for you today, if that's okay.
Sure.
I'll be curious about how history was recorded during the Song dynasty. Would there be an official department in the government that will actually go out to record these events? Is there like an official history of the Song dynasty that you could find in the Chinese world?
Oh yes, actually from the Han dynasty onwards, this is one way I believe the Chinese differ from the rest of the world in terms of history keeping. I call it history keeping. What happens is that after the grand historian, who we all know wrote 史记, records of grand historian that covered everything. I think we spoke about him last week. So after the Han dynasty, the Chinese actually came up with this very unique system of writing history. What happens is that during the dynasty itself, they have these official record keepers, the 史官, which basically translates to the history official, a very rough translation of history official. So their job is basically to document every single thing that happens. So the emperor woke up at 4 a.m. today. He went to the toilet and took a dump. Things like that, even very mundane things like that. They were all recorded. But this job of recording things, it actually goes all the way back until the spring and autumn and warring states period. That's how we have such a detailed documentation of what happened in Chinese history. So this is one part of it. During the life of an emperor, these people will be recording everything that he did and all the events that happened. And at the end of when the emperor passed away, they would have a kind of a summary to summarize up his reign and his life. Okay, that's still another part. So that's the next step up, right? And what is really unique about Chinese history is that the succeeding dynasty would be the one writing the official history. So Han Dynasty history would technically be written by the Jin Dynasty historians, based on all these first-hand documentations that we are talking about.
Oh, wow.
That
So they
recorded
compile them and they will synthesize that into...
Yes. So what happens is that when you're talking about the Song Dynasty, so Song Dynasty history would actually be written by the Yuan Dynasty historians, where they would, when the changeover of dynasty take over, usually one of the most important things that the new rulers would take over is actually the royal archives. So that is actually one of the most important thing to take over, because not only does it's not just because of the histories, but because it's all the financial records, all the land surveys, all the maps, all the, all the statistics and everything. And the Chinese kept very, very detailed and meticulous records of all these things.
Yeah, you would need to have over such a diverse landscape, and in terms of range and scale.
Yeah, you're ruling over, like we said last week.
And this is before the internet, before we had sensors, before we had flying cameras.
The age of physical media.
The age of physical media. Yeah. Okay.
So they all kept these records, and the historians of the next succeeding dynasty would be the ones to compile all these records and write the history of this dynasty. So that is the interesting part. There's one small exception though. Ming Dynasty emperors, they actually have these even more detailed records of their daily life, like really noting down every single word they said, every interaction they had. If I'm not wrong, the Ming Dynasty emperors had this thing called the Qiju Lu, which means records of daily living, which was documented
early
by
vlogging.
Yeah, basically vlogging, but a very dry vlog, basically.
Yep.
So that record will be kept by, if I'm not wrong, his one of his closest attendants, his eunuch, one of his closest eunuch. So they'll record that. But what happened is during the Ming Dynasty, a lot of times after the emperor passed away, they will actually kind of like censor their record. Like certain things that kind of like, maybe.
So there's a lot of power.
Yeah. So maybe this emperor had a certain kink or something that might not look good on the official records. Let's not put it in. And trust me, Ming emperors had a lot of kings. Yeah. So yeah, that's how Chinese history was recorded. And one of the main reasons why it happens this way is that there is no unnecessary exaggeration and glorification of the reign of these emperors and dynasty. Like, let's say if I am the emperor and my historian is writing the history of my reign, of course, this person would be under pressure. I can't say anything bad about his reign. I can't say anything bad about the emperor's reign because I might get beheaded, So what happens is that, okay, so in our dynasty, we just keep records. Let's leave the historical
interpretation to
the future generations, where they can look at it from...
They can make sense of the numbers or the documentation.
Yes. So that is the culture, you could say the very early academic culture of history, or on the topic of history, in China. So yeah, that is something pretty unique to our people.
So as RP recommended earlier, if you'd like to take a deep dive into the Song Dynasty, a great entry point will be checking out Water Margin, UFA 传, if I'm not wrong, and the Condor Heroes trilogy. Thank you so much for tuning in, everybody. This concludes our second episode of Both Sides Now, 观望东西，聆听左右. RP, thank you so much for your time. If I could push you just one more time before we conclude the session today. Yeah. That would be, what's your singer's biggest takeaway because you have spent a lot of time, I mean, last episode and today looking at Song Dynasty. If there's one single biggest takeaway from studying this unique time period in Chinese history, what would that be?
There is this contemporary colloquialism, I think, that came out from China this for a couple of years, says 人不作死就不会死.
Okay. If you could interpret that for me, that would be great.
Don't commit unnecessary self-sabotage. Simple as that. You don't sabotage yourself, nothing will happen to you. A lot of a lot of bleed that happened to us is self-inflicted. A lot of our problems are self-inflicted. So, you know, especially if you study the Song Dynasty and what I said just now, a lot of their problems are self-inflicted because of their philosophy
GDP
and their ideology.
multiple times the size of Europe. That's the kind of upside they had.
Exactly.
Self-sabotage.
And they
That's
ended
what
up
did them in.
Yeah, that's what did them in the end. They self-sabotage. So remember, 人不作死就不会死. Simple as that. And it applies today. Look at things that's going on around you today, and a lot of it is actually, you know, kind of true to this phrase.
Thank you once again for sharing your thoughts with us, RP. This is Both Sides Now, signing off for this week. Bye-bye.
Bye, Bob, and I'll see you. 3, 2, 1.